Which special occasions deserve a poem?
I think there are many occasions where if you can turn in a good poem, stand up and read it, people will have a wonderful time. It may earn you all kinds of praise and affection. So if you can stand up and read a brilliant poem at a wedding, a funeral, some kind of commemorative act around a birth, saying goodbye to a friend, mocking a boss, there are all kinds of occasions where if you can turn in a good poem, it's very, very rewarding.
How can I write a good poem about someone I know?
I think in British culture, if you want to write a poem about somebody you know in a public kind of way, almost certainly it will be slightly mocking, probably some kind of parody, slightly ironic, because that's the way we are. We tend not to want to say, I think you're absolutely wonderful and you're really, really wonderful and you're really, really wonderful. We want to kind of do something a bit tongue in the cheek, a bit raised eyebrow. So play to that, play to the irony, I would say.
How do I write a love poem?
I think if you want to write a love poem about somebody that you love, then you want to be able to say something that catches their breath, that it isn't something you've ever said directly face to face to that person, and that they didn't know that you felt that, they didn't know that you thought that, they didn't know that you remembered that. So try to find something that is going to really amaze them, really surprise them. Not because it's grand and big, it might actually be very small, but it might be because it's something unusual, what they didn't expect.
Do I write a poem for a wedding?
I think if you're celebrating a wedding, and you're neither the bride nor the bridegroom, I think if you want to have everybody enjoying that poem, almost certainly it will say something slightly scurrilous, something slightly naughty, but not too naughty, and it will also be something, I suppose, in the broad sense of the word, cultural. You'll be invoking something to do with the person's background, something to do with how they got together. People like to share that sort of thing, and ideally a bit of a laugh as well.
How do I write a poem for a funeral?
I often say to people before funerals, have a good funeral. And what I mean by that is that, I'll put it the other way, if you have a bad funeral, it is appalling, because all you do is remember that there was something wrong with the way you said goodbye. So to have a good funeral, it means that all the people in the room are somehow thinking of that person in their own way. So if you can contribute to that with a poem, because you're going to remember that person in your own way, I think that will help that moment to be a good funeral. Be personal, be observational. Don't worry about expressing too much feeling, because the room will be full of feeling anyway.
What are the most common poetry forms?
The form we're most familiar with now in English language is what is broadly called the lyric. It's a short poem that expresses a feeling. It might be a scene, it might be a moment, a memory, an observation. That's the form that is most used now. But of course there are many others, the epic, the long narrative poem, the interior monologue, stream of consciousness type poem, the litany, the question and answer poem, the ballad. So there's a huge range of forms, but the most popular now is the lyric.
Do different forms of poetry fulfill different purposes?
There's a way in which, once you start writing to a particular pattern, shape or form, the form itself starts to lay down the way in which you'll write about it. If you start writing something in, let's say, the ballad form, little 4-line verses, it will start having a momentum of its own. And this applies across most forms. They will start dictating how you see things. If you have start off with a question and answer form, well then obviously things will get very binary. If you tried a sonnet, most sonnets have a turning point. You contemplate something and then you turn and say, well, is it like that or isn't it like that? So the form will start dictating how you think and how you write.
What is the hardest form of poetry to write, and why?
I think if you're really just setting out, then some forms are pretty forbidding. There are some verse structures that are quite rigid, rhyming schemes and so on, that you might find pretty hard to say something original using those rhyme schemes. And it's probably pretty difficult to set out and write a long, weighty narrative poem of some sort or another, the way that in particular, say, the Romantic poets did. They would be pretty hard to do, I'd say.
How do I choose what form to use?
You can consciously sit down and say, today I will write a sonnet, today I will write free verse, and you can just do it like that, say, that's what I'll try and do. Another way is, as you're thinking about what you're going to write, let the voices from your reading start coming into your head and see, if you like, sense where those voices have come from. Ah, that came from that dramatic monologue that I read by Robert Browning. Oh, yes, I know how that goes. And then the form, in a way, will speak to you. So it's from two ways on. The highly conscious end, one way, and then, if you like, I suppose it's an associative way from the other end.
What is free verse?
The negative way of describing free verse is to say that it's a way of writing poems that don't have a clearly defined regular rhythm and don't have a clearly defined rhyme. So what they have instead are lines of writing, and those lines are determined by how you want to make the person read it. They determine the rhythm and the breathing pattern of how you'll read. So you have a long line, which you say, well, all with one breath, and then short lines maybe that break up the speech. That's free verse.
What is a lyric poem?
A lyric poem is really a poem that's about a page long or a bit less, and is about a feeling, an observation, or a scene that you care about.
What is a ballad?
A ballad is a narrative poem, usually in what are called quatrains, 4-line rhyming verses, that doesn't characterise. It's powerful on narrative, powerful on drama, and doesn't bother to tell you much about the people.
What is a haiku?
A haiku is a form developed primarily in Japan, and it's a syllabic poem. That's to say, it has 5 syllables in the first line, 7 syllables in the second, and 5 in the third. And usually it's a simple observation of a moment and the contemplation of that moment.
What is a sonnet?
A sonnet is primarily a 14-line poem, and then within that there are several forms. So you can have a sonnet that ends on a powerful couplet that sums up the rest of the poem. Another kind of sonnet divides between 8 lines and 6 lines, and the first 8 lines are the contemplation, and the last 6 lines are the ironic reflection. And there are various other sonnet forms, but essentially it's a 14-line poem.
What is rhyme?
Rhyme is a way of repeating sounds. So if you take the word gate, that rhymes with mate, so I've repeated the A and the T, but changed the very first sound. And essentially that's what rhyme is, and we seem to like it. We seem to like that echoing. It's a way of linking words that maybe otherwise wouldn't be linked. So if you link gate with mate, you'll suddenly be starting thinking about maybe you met your mate by the gate and turning that into a poem. So rhyme is a way of linking ideas based on the sound that those ideas make.
Does a poem have to rhyme?
The question, do poems have to rhyme? the best way to think about this is if you read the first translations of the Bible, they took a Hebrew poem, often called the Song of Solomon, and translated it into what we would now call free verse. And the same goes for the Psalms. So people knew in the 17th century that you could have poems that don't have to rhyme. Now, it took a long time for people to have the nerve to start writing new poems in a way that didn't rhyme. I think the first person who did it was probably the German poet Heinrich Heine, who wrote some poems about looking at the North Sea. And he discovered that you could just write a contemplation of the North Sea and not make it rhyme. And ever since then, various people have thought it's quite a good idea.
Do different types of rhyme create different effects?
If you make your rhymes less obvious and perhaps even less perfect, this will give you more scope to say things in a slightly more complex way. Then the rhyme becomes, if you like, it doesn't become a straitjacket and doesn't funnel you down one path that probably will end up sounding slightly comic.
Is it cheating to use a rhyming dictionary?
I most certainly don't think it's cheating to use a rhyming dictionary. Rhyming dictionaries throw up all kinds of extraordinary surprises because in English we don't always spell the same sounds in the same way. So if I want to make the oo sound, I can make it o-o, or I can in fact use ou, as in you. So you are in a way constantly surprised by what words rhyme. And so, allow yourself that luxury, if you like. Flick over the pages of a rhyming dictionary and go, oh, God, I never thought of together and weather as being a rhyme, but of course it is.
How do I convey meaning in a poem?
Meaning comes to us in poems through several levels. We always think of words as referring to things, so that's, if you like, the semantic level. But there's a musical level with poems. That's to say their rhythms and the sounds you're making, like alliteration, assonance, rhyme. But also if you repeat things, you imply meanings. So, for example, if you just said rain, raining, rain, raining, rain, raining, you're suggesting it's raining for a long time. So, and also if you frame a poem, you suggest there's some kind of continuity from the way you open the poem and the fact that you've repeated it at the end of a poem. You can create pauses, you can hurry things up and you can slow them down. You can introduce jazz and syncopation to suggest some kind of modernity. So poems have a whole musical frame that also conveys meaning.
How can I use symbolism effectively in my poem?
In a way, when you write, you can't escape symbolism, because if you just say, I'm now writing about a table, the question in the reader's eyes, well, why have you thought of that table? And the table, as you write about it, will always be representative of something more than the table, because you've chosen it. At the same time, there are things that are obviously more symbolic in our culture than other things. If you use a word like shield, or if you use a word like sword, these have long symbolic meanings that stretch right back through hundreds of years. My own feeling, and it's only a prejudice, is if you try to write modern, emblematic, symbolic verse, we find it quite difficult to unlock. But that's not to speak against it, because, where would we be without symbols?
What's the difference between imagery and symbolism in poetry?
Usually we use the word symbol to mean a specific word that we understand to be representing something else. So just as we say in life that an orb held by the monarch represents the kingdom that the monarch rules over, so you could say that some things are symbolic. So if suddenly you're lying on your back and you're looking at a bird flying free, and you talk about this lark flying and getting freer and freer, then in a way the lark symbolises freedom. Imagery, usually we use it to mean something slightly less explicit and more ambiguous, not tied up so neatly. We usually would use the word symbol to say that is symbolic of that, but an image resonates. It has lots of meanings that you can speculate about.
How can I use rhythm effectively in my poem?
The lovely thing about language is you can never escape rhythm. If I simply say to you, I'm going out now, that actually has a rhythm. I'm going out now. And if you want to know what the rhythm is, just repeat it. I'm going out now, I'm going out now, I'm going out now. And there's the rhythm. And that's because we've got consonants and syllables, and they're breaking things up into stress and unstress. So really, you'll always write with rhythm. Now the question is whether you exploit it. Now if you want to exploit it, I would say use it with care, make sure that the rhythm is part of what it is you want to say, because rhythm expresses meaning. You know, an obvious case would be if you write a poem about a train, you may want to express the rhythm of the train without necessarily drawing attention to the fact that's what you're doing. So, you know, you can use the rhythms of life in the rhythms of the words you use.
How can I use diction effectively in my poem?
Language has what we call loosely consonants and vowels. And the consonants are these stopping points where we're using our lips and our tongue against our teeth or something at the back of the throat. And then we have these open sounds, which we call vowels. If you repeat the closing ones, we tend to call that alliteration. I once had an advert through the door when I was a kid that said, Britain's biggest bunker bargain. Well, obviously I'm repeating the B, that's alliteration. With assonance, you're repeating that open sound. The cat sat on the mat. The A sound is what I'm repeating as well as the rhyme, of course. So that's assonance when you repeat the open sound. You can play with these and use these. Quite what the effect is, no one ever really quite knows. If you write a poem and you have a lot of M's in it, people will tell you that that's very musical and murmury. If you write a poem or a line with a lot of S's in, people will say that you're hissing and you're snake-like and quite angry. But it doesn't have to be. So, you know, I would say always use those things with care and think out why you're using them.
How hard is it to become a published poet?
In one way, it's tremendously easy to become a published poet. All you've got to do is type something onto your computer and print it out 2 times and keep one copy and hand the other one to someone else. Then you have published that poem. And you can expand that by saying, oh, well, I'll put 20 poems together and make it into a little book and hand it around my relatives and friends. So then you're becoming more of a published poet. You can send your poems off to magazines and to newspapers, locally or nationally. And if you get one of those published, now that's quite hard. I'd say very hard. I don't think I've ever succeeded, and I have tried often enough. And getting a book of poems published is usually very hard, getting it published by somebody else other than yourself. But I think it's a great place to start, is publishing poems yourself. Because, you know, you can turn them out and get them around to friends and relations, and you'll hear what they think of it and what they make of it, and that's a great teacher.
Does a professional poet need an agent?
I don't think any writer has to have an agent. Agents are very good at looking over contracts, and they're quite good at putting your stuff around, but you know, you can do that yourself. It's said that some publishers won't look at a writer's work unless they have an agent, but you know, you can make a name for yourself in other ways, through performance, through appearing in small magazines, that an agent can't do that for you. So no, I don't think you have to have an agent.
How do you self-publish poetry?
Anyone can self-publish. I mean, you can do it with a pen and a piece of paper, because all you've got to do is write a poem out several times and then hand it round to friends. I often think people make it too complicated, you see. That's all you have to do. Or if you've got a computer, you print off 10 copies and you hand it out to 10 friends. So that's where you can start. And then you could put several poems together and make a little booklet, fold it over, put a cover on it, hand it round to friends and relations. So it's pretty easy. And you can go up the scale. You can, you know, go and find someone who can make something that's like a little bit more professional and stick it together. Loads of people in every area, printers, mini publishers, if you like. So all that I think is pretty easy, and it doesn't have to cost you very much.
What are poetry publishers looking for?
To get published by a publishing house is pretty difficult. They've got to be convinced that your book will sell probably more than 1,000 copies. So, that's a pretty hard thing to do. So ideally, you'll have been quite successful with individual poems. They've got into anthologies, they've got into newspapers, they've got into small magazines, and you've got a pile of maybe 50 or 60, and they say, there's something here. I think this is going to convince people.
Do I have to write every day?
I don't think you have to write every day to be a poet, but probably if you really are serious about wanting to write poetry, there probably has to be a time every day where you put yourself in a kind of poetic frame of mind. And by that I mean that you start wondering or thinking about something that might one day be a poem. So whether that involves you actually writing, or whether it involves staring out the window of a bus and thinking, oh, I don't think about shoes, and start playing with it. So I would say every day do something to do with poetry, yes.
How do I get my poetry published professionally?
I think if you really want to get published, a collection of your poems, you've got to have already been out there. No one will take a pile of poems if you're completely unknown, unless there's something really, really extraordinary and exceptional about you. So that means that you've got to try and get your poems into small poetry magazines, which there are plenty. You've got to start reading your poems out loud at poetry clubs. You've got to try to maybe get some poems into some anthologies that other people are putting together. Maybe try to get the odd poem or two onto radio, local radio perhaps. You've got to try all these areas and then see after several years whether you've got a body of work that will convince the 3 or 4 main big publishers of poetry or some of the smaller presses.
What is an anthology, a collection and a selection?
Yeah, there's several kind of quite technical words to do with poetry. We've got anthology, collection and selection. So an anthology traditionally means a collection of poems by a variety of poets. A collection of poems usually means one poet and that poet's collection of poems just for that year or that 10 years. A selection of poems usually means that you've published several collections and you've selected from the collections.
How can I get into an anthology?
If you want to get into an anthology, the best thing to do is to know the anthologist. I know that sounds nepotistic, but it nearly always works that way. Most anthologies are not of new poems, I have to say that. So it's quite hard to get into anthologies.
Can I make a living as a poet?
I think if you want to make a living as a poet, almost certainly you'll have to do something other than write poems. That's to say, you might have to perform, you might have to teach, you might have to work in publishing in some way or another to do with poetry. So you can carry on in the sort of poetry world, but probably you won't be able to make a living simply writing poems and selling them.
How many poems do I need to write to warrant my own book?
If you're not self-publishing, but you want to send off a pile of poems to a publisher, the publisher will want to know almost certainly that you've written at least 50 good poems.
Do poems need to be edited?
When you send your poems to a well-known publishing house, there are poetry editors there, and they have quite strong ideas about what makes for a good poem. And if they think that mostly your poems are pretty good, but they think that 1 or 2 could be improved, they will tell you. They will say, that isn't very good, or the first half was interesting and the second half was rubbish. They'll be quite explicit and quite tough with you.
Can I edit my poems myself?
I think it's very hard to edit your own poems, if you like, in a vacuum. You can only really edit your poems if you're having some kind of conversation with people that you respect, possibly admire, people who've got some experience of either editing or of writing very good poems. So it's pretty hard to do just purely in a vacuum.
What is poetry?
It's always very hard to answer the question, what is poetry? Because it's become so diverse. All the way from the traditional forms like ballads and nursery rhymes and lyrics through to very free forms that can be almost any shape on the page. But one common aspect of most poetry is that you don't have to explain where you are, who you are, or where the poem is going, and you don't have to resolve things in poems. So it can just be the middle of an experience, if you like. Now, of course, not all poems are, but basically you have that option in poetry.
Why do people write poetry?
I think people write poetry because they want to express something about themselves. At least it nearly always starts out like that. I mean, some people want to write about big, grand things, important things, political things, aspects of nature, the eternal aspects of the sky, the universe, or whatever, but there is always a sense around poetry that you're expressing something that is yours. I think it's a bit of an illusion because, you know, we're very social beings, so in the end you never really express something that's purely yours. You're always expressing something social, but that's what it feels like from the inside.
What are the main things that poetry does which prose doesn't?
Most prose operates in a way that is concerned with outcome. If it's non-fiction, then it'll be logical, chronological, it'll be some kind of observation, investigation, something along those lines. If it's fictional prose, then most fictional prose is concerned with presenting characters or beings and showing what will happen to them if they go through a set of experiences, a set of scenes, a set of events. Poetry doesn't usually do that. Of course, long narrative poems do, even short little clips of narratives do, but mostly poetry is more, how can I put it? It isn't so bothered with outcome. It's more tentative, it's a suggestive medium, and often leaves you in a state of ambiguity, ambivalence, contradiction, irony, so that you're not fully resolved. That's mostly what happens with poetry.
What makes something a poem rather than a collection of lines or words?
I think it's very hard to say what definitely makes a poem. You know, people want to make rules, and the moment you make the rules, you find that there are some great things that have been written that break those rules. In the end, poems are observations or collections of words and phrases that get you thinking. They invite you to ask questions, to be puzzled, to be curious.
Are there rules for writing poetry?
One phrase that I quite like about poetry is where people say that poems make the familiar unfamiliar and make the unfamiliar familiar, and they do that almost at the same time. And I think that's as far as I would take it. Anything else starts being too controlling and saying that it's got to be this shape or that shape, or it's got to have rhythm, or it's got to have rhyme, or whatever it is. I'll sit with that. I think that's good enough for me.
What makes a good poem?
I think if you are in some way or another surprised by a poem, and it could be surprised by the language, or the pictures, or the juxtaposition, or the pithiness, the way in which it's compressed things. If you are surprised by a poem, I'd say that probably that poem's doing its job for you. Whether that then is objectively a good poem, I wouldn't dare say, but it's doing its job if you are surprised.
What makes a bad poem?
I think if you read a poem and think you've been there before, you've read it all before, you've seen it all before, then the chances are it's a bad poem for you. It won't be a bad poem for everybody, but it probably is. It's not doing its job. You've been there before. No, it's not for you.
How long should a poem be?
Well, I think if we look historically at poems, you can say poems can be any length you want them to be. They can be like a tiny little fragment, or if you think of haiku, very, very short. But then if you take Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, it's hundreds of words long. Take Beowulf, it's, thousands of lines long. You take the great Indian epics, the Ramayana, things like that, thousands of lines long. So I think historically poems can be absolutely any length you want them to be. The world's shortest poem, I think, was written by somebody called Giles Brandreth, and it goes, "Ode to a goldfish, oh, wet pet."
What's the difference between poetry and song lyrics?
The question of whether poems and song lyrics are the same or whether they're different, I think turns on the fact that song lyrics can get away with supporting themselves with a melody. So that you can say something like, "I love you," or "love, love, love," over and over again, if there's a sufficiently good melody to, if you like, assist the word. Poems can't usually get away with that kind of repetition or ordinariness. There has to be something about a poem that is more intriguing, more surprising to draw you in. But that said, there's plenty of song lyrics that, in fact, if you just put them on the page, they read really well. Take McCartney's Blackbird, or one of the most well-known poems in the English language, The Owl and the Pussycat, which was probably written as a song anyway.
Do children really like poetry?
Some children like poetry, some children don't. They're human beings. They're mostly smaller than adults. But apart from that, there isn't much difference between children and adults. And yes, you'll find children who won't read a poem and others who are absolutely addicted to the stuff and write loads of poems themselves and read loads of poems. So, yeah, utterly various.
What's the best way to introduce kids to poetry?
I think we all introduce children to poetry, whether we like it or not. We do it through nursery rhymes, we do it through making up little jingles with their names. When you have a baby, you sit there saying "dooby dooby doo" and making up little poems, almost without knowing that's what you're doing. And then the question really is, how do we carry on? How do we expand poetry? And I think there are hundreds, if not thousands, of books that we could be reading to them. Whether we do or not is another matter, but they're all there waiting to read to them and to perform to them.
What kind of poems do children like to read?
I think most children will be attracted by funny poems. I think most people here in England, you could read them, say, Spike Milligan poems, silly verse for kids, and they'll find that funny, on the ning, nang, nong and that sort of thing. The question is whether they'll get intrigued and puzzled and amazed by other poems. And I think, my experience, most children will be intrigued by things that relate to their lives or are in some way or another wondrous and amazing.
Do humans have an instinct for poetry?
I think you could say that there are rhythms to do with our bodies. There's heartbeat, and there's our pace of walking, and there's our pace of running. If you create rhythms in language, that almost certainly has got something to do with our bodies. So when you create rhythms, there's some kind of echo in our kind of bodily system. The other thing is that we have words in our ears, and if you play with those words, let's say alliteration or assonance, things like that, then in some way or another that intrigues us because it's making language into something physical that we can play with our lips and tongue and teeth. So I think all that is quite important. Whether it's instinctive, I don't think I'd say that, but it is certainly to do with our bodies.
What are the benefits of getting your child into poetry?
Children will learn language just by listening to the people around them and practicing, which if you sit around a 1-year-old and a 2-year-old, they're doing it all the time. But if you introduce children to poetry and carry on reading poetry, well then, in a way you're introducing them to extraordinary specialisations of language. You're giving them cadences that they wouldn't otherwise have come across. But more than that, you're also introducing them to all kinds of feelings that they might not otherwise have come across, things that don't resolve themselves, and strange ironies and absurdities and strange juxtapositions where you use figurative, metaphorical language. I mean, these things are all present in language overall. It's just that in poetry they get compressed into an individual poem. So it's like any art form. It's got that ability to do something rather special.
Are there any good poetry resources for children?
The best poetry resource for children is ever so simple. It's this thing that was invented, a few hundred years ago. It's called a book. So they're in libraries, they're in bookshops, they're in schools. They're there. All you have to do is open them and see them. Now, what you then do with it, whether you perform it or whether you write it up on a wall or whether you find a way of performing it, that's another matter. But in terms of a resource, they're there. It all exists. Now, there are beginning to be resources on the internet. And if you put in the word poetry or poetry for children into Google, all sorts of things pop up. There's a poetry archive, for example, and there's poems performed by people like me. I'm trying to set up an interactive poetry performance site for children. That's something I'm in the process of doing. So, yeah, there are various ways, and also poets come into schools. If you look in your local listings mag, there might be a children's poet coming your way. That person will be a resource.
Who are your favourite children's poets?
The children's poets I like are nearly always the ones that I've met and perform with, because it's so wonderful to engage with the sound and the feeling of their poems. So John Agard, Grace Nichols, James Berry, Roger McGough, people less well known like Francesca Beard, Jared Lush, Jacob Samler, Rose, Jane Strickland. These are all people that I've really enjoyed performing with. Adrian Mitchell I've done shows with, absolutely wonderful. So these are people that I like doing shows with, and I love listening to what they've written.
Is it easier to write poems for children or for adults?
I don't think there's an easy or hardness kind of league table of writing poems. I suppose if you sat down and said, I will now write a sonnet, and it's got to be a classic Petrarchan sonnet, that would be pretty hard. I guess that would take me about a month to do. On the other hand, if you said, can you write a little jingle about chocolate or something, I could probably turn one out in about a couple of minutes. Whether it'd be any good or not is another matter. But so it is possible, once you've got into the groove, to entertain children with quite funny wordplay things. That is comparatively easy. And writing about complex, strange things for adults in a way that would surprise and interest them, I guess that can be complicated. But at the same time, you want to write something that is simple and important for children. I reckon that's pretty difficult.
Is poetry for children less technical than poetry for adults?
I think if you look across the history of children's poetry, I think you'll see that children's poetry has used virtually all the forms that poems for adults have used. If you take Edward Lear, for example, he's someone who uses enormous range of quite complex rhythms and rhymes. If you look at somebody like the American poet Carl Sandburg, who was crucial to the invention of American popular free verse, you can see that he's experimenting with forms in a way that are pretty important. I think you can look across children's poetry and say it's been as complex, formally speaking, as adult poetry.
At what age can kids start writing poems?
In my experience, 2- and 3-year-olds will start making up a kind of oral poetry. Just if you get into the habit of playing with words with them, that they so like the idea that words can make echoes or that they can repeat themselves and create rhythms. And so in a way I sort of think the moment we become proficient at language, we can make poems. Now whether you then write them down is another matter, because you can have an oral poetry culture or you can have a written one or a mixture of both. So I would say 2- and 3-year-olds are quite often pretty good poets, and so it can go on.
What kind of poems do children like to write?
I think children will write poems partly depending on the repertoire of poems they come across. I often think that the job of teachers and parents is to make that repertoire as wide as possible so children can adopt voices and patterns of words and phrases that suit them for the moment. If you only give children rhymey, jingly type poems, then the chances are they'll be the only kind of poems they'll make up. If you show them that there are all sorts of other patterns you can make with words, just repetition for example, then they'll discover that has its own power and use as well.
How can I encourage my child to try writing a poem?
I think if you're a parent and you would like your child to write poems, my guess is the very best thing you can do is just read them poems at bedtime. People think that there's some sort of magical jump or leap that you have to make, but if you fill your child's head with the voice of poems, that will probably be sufficient. If it isn't, I would think the next thing you could do is show a child that you write poems. We've got this strange idea that we should somehow or other get children to do things that we wouldn't do ourselves. No, write a poem yourself and say, hey, look at me, I'm writing a poem. You could do that.
Do children enjoy performing poetry?
I think some children enjoy performing poetry and some don't. I think when it comes to performing poetry, you have to find ways that play to children's strengths. Sometimes, for example, they like saying things in chorus. Other children might quite like to mime to a poem or make what I call snapshots, like a kind of tableau that goes with the poem. Other children might like to make a little bit of music to go with the poem, or percussion, or maybe do a painting, or do, hold up individual words, clap their hands. So I think you have to explore all the potential around a poem and not just simply think, recite I wandered lonely as a cloud and then sort of give them a bad mark if they do it badly.
What are some good themes for children to write poems about?
Well, always a good starting point for children is something to do with themselves. It's not the only one, but they lead lives full of complexity, full of wonder, anxiety, fears, loves. So in and around that, based quite concretely on things that happen, someone nicks a teddy bear, or they get up to some kind of mischief that they don't want to tell you about, and things like that. So that's one area, but the other area is what you might call the wonder area, where you speculate and say what if. What if is actually quite a good way to begin a poem, and then just see where it takes you, that if you start inventing things. And another area, you can exploit your own dreams, and you can show children they can kind of farm their dreams and turn them into poems.
Can writing poetry help children emotionally in difficult times?
I think we all have the right to reflect on our experiences. Now, quite often I get the impression that children are sometimes not given that space. I think if you don't have a chance to reflect on your experience, you up your levels of anxiety and stress. And I think poetry gives you a space where you can stop the flow of experience and give yourself a chance to grab a bit of the things that have happened to you, put them on a page in a certain order, and then sit and wonder about it. And I think that probably enables you to deal with some of the things that you worry about and wonder about and don't know about.
Is poetry taught well in schools?
I think at the moment mostly poetry is taught absolutely appallingly in schools, because we're now living under a regime that thinks that what you do with poems is you keep asking children and school students questions that you, either as the teacher or the examiner, already know the answer to. I think that's mostly just an exercise in humiliation, and that really what we should be doing is only asking children questions about poems that we don't know the answers to. So ideally we should be asking questions like, does this poem remind you of anything? Does it remind you of anything you've read? Are there any questions you would like to ask about this poem? Are there any questions you would like to ask of anybody or anything in the poem? Are there any questions you would like to ask of the author? And then to get the children to be the people in the poem, or to be the author, and see what answers come up. I think only then will we liberate poetry from this kind of appalling prison that we've put it in.
Can adults learn anything from the poems children write?
I think we can often learn things from the poems that children write. You learn what interests them, what amazes them, what they're puzzled by. When I'm reading children's poems, I mean, I don't like to say particularly whether this poem or that poem is good or bad. I think what I sort of always look for is something that feels authentic. Now, that's very vague and woolly, but sometimes when you read poems and you think, well, maybe they're just kind of repeating something they've heard and maybe not thinking or reflecting or playing in some kind of way that is true to themselves. It's just a hunch you have when you're reading. So the word authentic is the word I use to myself when reading children's poems.
Does everyone harbour a hidden poet?
Oh, yes, no, anybody can write poems. Now, sometimes people need some help or a bit of nudging or whatever, but no, anybody can write a poem. And I would say that if you want to find out whether you can write a poem, probably the best thing to do is give yourself some time and space to read some poems by a variety of authors.
What poets would you recommend for beginners?
I think if you're looking around for poems to read and you're feeling a bit kind of uneasy, I would go and maybe dig out some anthologies. There's plenty on sale and in libraries. And just flick over the pages. Don't feel intimidated by it. You don't have to read every poem. You don't even have to read most of the poems. Just flick over the pages, and when you see something that catches your eye, read it. You don't even have to read the whole poem. And maybe start finding some phrases, some verses, some whole poems that intrigue you, and then sort of speculate as to why you are interested in that poem, why that had an echo for you, why it resonated with you. So play with poems. That's the crucial thing.
Where can I learn about technical poetry?
If you're really interested in using the resources of poetry of the past with all the technical inventions that people have developed over hundreds of years, well, Stephen Fry has done it for you. He's got a book called The Ode Less Travelled, and there he's got virtually every form that has ever been used, your triolets and your dactyls and your spondies and the whole lot, all laid out in page after page, so you can follow his do-it-yourself guide, The Ode Less Travelled by Stephen Fry.
How important is a poet's notebook?
I think one of the most important things that someone who wants to be a writer can do is just have a notebook. And in that notebook, don't feel that you've got to write something amazingly interesting or important. Just jot down sounds, thoughts, observations, things you've heard people say, anything that surprised you, you thought was a little bit odd, a little bit interesting, a little bit profound. It could be lines from poems, proverbs, something you heard on the bus, something you saw, some kind of contrast that interested you, or a comparison. And just make it's really your kind of bank of ideas. And use it, read it, look back at it, play with it, scribble on it. That's an incredible resource for you.
What advice do you have for wannabe poets?
I think if you've started to write, but you haven't written much, and you think, oh, I'd like to do some more, but it's got a bit sort of sticky and it isn't working, I say you've got to give yourself the time and space to do a little bit of reading around. Get a sense of the movements of poets that there have been in the past, the Romantics, the Georgians, the free verse lot, the objectivists, find out about these poets and what got them all racked up and excited by inventing new forms, and then play yourself, say, well, I'll have a go at writing that, I'll have a go at this observational thing, I'll have a go at this imagism, I'll have a go at this confessional stuff, and see what happens. I mean, it may be rubbish, but it doesn't matter. You've got to play with it, and you've got to get a sense of what's out there and what you can do.
What advice do you have for those who don't get poetry?
I don't want to bully people into reading poetry if they really don't see the point. Though what's quite interesting is that people who say they don't see the point, and then something happens, they turn up at a funeral and find that they want a poem because they feel they want to express something about that moment that is going to be interesting or different or be sonorous in some kind of a way. So All I can say is that, no, I don't want to bully anybody, but you never know, a poem might come up behind you and whack you over the head and you suddenly find, oh, yeah, it does speak to me. How odd.
Can you teach someone to be a good poet?
I think that there are people about who know how to accompany people who want to be poets. They somehow or other can create some kind of electricity in the room through reading other poems and helping people learning how to write that actually helps someone to develop into being a good poet. Yes, it is possible. It's some kind of journey that you can go on with another person and through reading and writing with that other person. I think that is possible, yes.
What do you think of fridge poetry?
I quite like fridge poetry for a bit. It's sort of one of those things where, you know, like you think you might like to eat something and then you just eat a bit too much of it and then you don't like it quite so much. I think the problem with fridge poetry is that to start off with, it's like, hey, amazing, wow, look, I've got this incredible thing going here, and then somehow or other you get slightly tired of it. But the first flush is great, and I think, you know, if you do like poems, and you do like writing poems, it can be quite a platform where you can sort of take off into other areas, but it seems to be a sort of law of diminishing returns with it, and I'm not quite sure why. I suppose it's because the word bank itself is finite.
Are there any tools that can help with writing poetry?
I think if you're looking around for tools to support the writing of poetry, well, you know, old Roget's Thesaurus is not bad. You know, you kind of you're trying to find a word for being dismayed, and you look up dismayed, and you see 20 other words there. I mean, the advantage of Roget is it's got a kind of negative effect. You say, well, I don't want any of those words, and you suddenly think, oh, I want the word sad, because it actually works better because you've got a few S's in that line. So that's a good trigger, I think. Roget's Thesaurus. Rhyming dictionaries are handy if you're looking for rhymes. I often think the best tool is just a book of poems, so that you open a book of poems and you say, hey, wow, I could write about something a bit like that. It's nearly always done the job for me.
What does a day in the life of a children's laureate involve?
Well, I've been a Children's Laureate since June the 11th, and today is July the 10th, I think. And every day has been completely different. So it's really like a patchwork. I mean, when I get home in the evening, I have no idea. It's not in my head what I'm doing tomorrow, the next day. So I look in my diary and it says things like 2 o'clock British Library, but I haven't put down who it is that I'm supposed to see. So I have no idea. Every day is completely different. And at the moment, it's a mixture of appearances, performances, interviews, radio programs, getting on my ISDN line at home, that's a radio line, and talking to Radio Cambridgeshire about nursery rhymes, and the next minute being interviewed for, I don't know, the Daily Telegraph or something like that. So at the moment, I have no idea. Every day has got about 5 appointments, and each one of them completely different.
What drives you to write poetry?
I write poems because I find they're the easiest form that I can find to say what I feel, to say what I think about the experiences that I have. It's the simplest and easiest form I can have of remembering things. And also, it's a form that I can use to have fun. I can play with words, play with language. So it's probably a combination of all those.
When did you first discover you were a poet?
I think the first time I realised that I wanted to write poems, I was about 16, and I'd read poems by D.H. Lawrence, Gerard Manley Hopkins, A. Housman, in a little book called The Pageant of Modern Poetry. So this would be in the late 50s, early 60s, around then, and I thought, yes, I would like to write poems.
Why do you write poems for children?
Well, I didn't start out writing poems for children. I thought I was writing poems about my childhood in a way that adults would find interesting. But apart from one BBC producer in schools radio, as it used to be called, really nobody in the children's book world was, or the children's world, if you like, was very interested, and nobody in the adult world was interested. So I wrote some more, and then in the end, it was a woman who worked in a small publisher called Andre Deutsch in London, and she thought they would make the poems would make a good poetry book for children. I was then married to Quentin Blake, if you like, and the first book came out in 1974.
What do you like most about writing poetry?
I think what I like most about writing poetry is that it can express what I want to express at almost any time of day, any mood, anything that I want to reflect on. So I carry around with me a big pad, and when something occurs to me, I can write it in, write down something in the pad. When I want to remember something and then try and get to the meaning of it. If I think, I could write something quite entertaining about that. So it's like it's like a wardrobe full of clothes, that all fit.
What is the hardest part of being a poet?
I think the hardest bit about being a poet is sort of knowing when to stop tinkering with something. That you've written something and you think, I'll leave it, and then you look at it the next day and think, no, I won't leave it, I've got to fiddle around with that bit. Well, that can go on forever. And in a way it does, because if you read your poems in public, well, you can go on fiddling about with them in the way you read them out loud to people. So I suppose it's the hardest thing is knowing when to stop. And if you look at the manuscripts of poems in the British Library that are on show, you can see people like Wilfred Owen tinkering around with poems that we know terribly well and are totally frozen. And you can see he's put his lines through, he scribbled out things and you think, wow, that was pretty good. Why didn't he leave that in? So everybody's at it, I think.
Where do you find inspiration?
I think, first of all, I get inspiration from spotting things that are slightly odd or ironic or absurd and wanting to express that irony. So it might be something I see, or, it might even be a language thing. I noticed, quite obvious really, that the word tense, T-E-N-S-E, is also the same, I pronounce it the same way as I pronounce the word tense, T-E-N-T-S. So I thought, what if you wrote something about tense, getting tense? So, there was an absurdity, something completely silly, and I started writing about it. But also sometimes I'm spurred by, if somebody asks me a question like, what did you do when? So my daughter asked me, what was my bedroom like when I was a kid? And I suddenly remembered that when my brother moved out of my bedroom into the bedroom next door, I tried to drill a hole in the wall with the corner of a ruler. But of course I had to cover it up so that my dad didn't see it. And I suddenly started describing it, and I thought, I must write about that.
What other poets have most inspired you?
Well, I write these adult prose poems. They're really kind of paragraphs or fragments. And the person who was talking to me, if you like, from the page when I started writing those was Raymond Carver. Raymond Carver writes these prose poems and short stories, so that's what triggered those off. That's the adult stuff. The children's stuff, I don't know, I think it's a bit difficult to say really. Well, one of the voices that triggered those off was an American poet called Carl Sandburg, who collected voices of people and turned them into books. So Carl Sandburg's voice, if you like, is very strong. D.H. Lawrence still. And then writing now, Roger McGough, I think, Brian Patton. They're two people who speak quite loudly, if you like. And then I suppose certain aspects of the way John Agard performs his poems has affected me. That's probably about it, I think. Yes, maybe Jackie Kay. I've read some poems by Jackie Kay, and I've thought, that's lovely, the way she's turned that experience into something that she's reflected on in a certain kind of way. And I thought, I'd quite like to do that. So they're probably the poets who influence me now. Yeah.
How long does it take you to write a poem?
The length of time it takes you to write a poem, it really is how long is a piece of string. Sometimes you hit lucky and you get a form and a shape and the words flow and you get it all out in about a minute and a half and it's there, boom, just like that. Or orally even, if you're in the car and your kids are wanting to make up silly rhymes for them. And it just comes and you think, oh yes, I'll keep that. And then other times it can take a year. So, you know, no one should ever think a poem takes a certain amount of time to write. You know, it just, or, you know, it could even take 10 years to write a poem if it's one that you never quite get right and it sits there on the shelf and then you pull it down again and you think, oh, I could tinker with that and put it back on the shelf. So, very, very quickly, very, very slowly.
Where's the best place to write poetry?
I think the best place to write for me is some kind of space where I can block out the rest of the world. Now, for some people, that's in a very quiet, lonely little place. But for me, I find that the best place of all is in a railway train. So that if I'm actually in the train sitting there and I've got just a little bit of elbow room and no one's immediately next to me, somehow or other that idea of zooming through the countryside in this strange cylinder that we call a train, and I find I can write. I can write at home, but railway trains are best for me.
How do you go from inspiration to poem?
First thing I do when I think I'm going to be writing a poem is just instantly start scribbling. I mean, preceding all that, there will have been several minutes, hours or weeks of contemplation. And it's very hard to describe that contemplation. It's like a daydreaming. It's like a what-ifing, where you say what if about the things you might write down. So you're playing with words, playing with phrases, playing with sentences and shapes in my mind, and then take up the pencil and start scribbling. Now, when I'm starting to scribble, it's usually quite a mess, usually, because some of those phrases that were floating around in my mind go down, others aren't there, so I'm having to push it a bit and find what's right. Le mot juste, as the French would say, the right word. And then it's basically fiddling. You then try to sort of smarten it up and get it so the rhythm on the page reflects the rhythm that you want to say it.
Do you prefer writing or performing?
I think if I was really honest, and I'm not going to lie, I would say that I enjoy the performing more than the writing. If I would just like to fib a little bit, I'd say, oh yes, I definitely enjoy the writing. And that performing is, it's just a little optional extra. But no, I'm going to be honest here and say that the business of standing in front of 300 or 400 children and building for a laugh with words that I've written down and then finding just the right way to perform them, is incredibly satisfying. But of course it's not really an either or, because the performances are leaning on what I've written. So I know that when I sit down to write, that if I write this well, this will make for a great performance piece. And that in itself is very satisfying.
Do you edit your poems as you write?
I think mostly I do quite a lot of tinkering, because if I look back at the drafts that I've got, well, it'd be quite hard for anybody else to read them, I think. They're just quite a mess, really, the page. I mean, I can see where it goes, but quite often there's arrows and down to the bottom with an asterisk and a lot of scribbling out, and then a few more insertions, and then maybe over the page I start again. All I can say is, I usually do quite a lot of tinkering, and I think probably most poets would say the same. D.H. Lawrence claimed that the spontaneous first writing was terribly important, and I would agree with that. But whether you leave it or not, whether you're bold and brave enough, I think the problem is when your first throw, the chances are you will say some things in quite a banal way, because quite often the first phrasings that come to the surface are quite kind of common and usual and banal, and really you quite often want to make things a little stranger than that, a little more surprising, and that needs a bit of work.